Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Bilani, and I am a senior majoring in public health in the College of Natural Sciences at the UT Austin. I also work in the college's Office of Experiential Learning, which connects students to opportunities to research, study abroad, intern, volunteer, and have other out-of-class experiences that are hands-on and enriching. I want to welcome you all today to today's Texas Science Festival session, Guardians of Our Water. Today's presentation is coming to you from the city of Austin and the University of Texas. In Austin, we love our rankings and take pride in what makes our city special. So, before we dive into today's session, I wanted to share a few fun facts about Austin before covering some housekeeping details and introducing our two speakers. Austin is known for both its water and its wildlife. We are home to the historic Barton Springs, consistently ranked as one of the state's best natural swimming pools by publications such as Texas Monthly and Texas Travel. The pool remains around 70 degrees year-round, and you'll be hearing more about the science behind Barton Springs from our speakers today. Today, March 3rd, happens to be World Wildlife Day. Austin has repeatedly been recognized by the National Wildlife Federation as the best U.S. city for wildlife. In today's session, we'll learn how scientists here at UT have discovered wildlife species that play a crucial role in safeguarding our water. We'll also hear from a hydrogeologist about what we can all do to preserve our local water system. As the moderator for today's session, I'm excited to welcome our brilliant and talented speakers. Each expert will present for a few minutes, followed by a Q&A session. But before that, a few quick housekeeping notes. Chat is disabled for today's session. There will be a Q&A function in which you can submit your questions at any time, and we'll address them at the end of the presentations. This talk will be recorded, and it will be available on the College of Natural Sciences YouTube channel. Now, I'd like to invite both of our speakers on screen for introductions and a quick icebreaker. Dr. David Hillis is the Alfred W. Rourke Centennial Professor of Biology at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the director of UT's Biodiversity Center and a leader in the Texas Field Station Network, where scientists and students conduct research at dedicated sites across Texas. Dr. Hillis is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a MacArthur Fellow, among many other accolades. He serves as the faculty advisor for UT's Dean Scholars, an honors program in the College of Natural Sciences. He is the author of an award-winning 2023 book, Armadillos to Sisyphus, a naturalist in the Texas Hill Country, a collection of essays on the ecology, biodiversity, and restoration of the Texas Hill Country. His research focuses on molecular evolution, phylogenetics, and systematics, and fittingly, for UT, he's an expert in longhorn cattle. As the owner of the Double R Helix Ranch, he breeds them himself. Justin Camp is a hydrogeologist technician with the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District. Born and raised in Austin, Justin grew up exploring Little Bear and Bear Creek in his backyard, fostering a deep connection to the Central Texas landscape. His passion for studying and protecting the region's critical natural resources has led him to work for the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District since 2015. Okay, David, Justin, before we get going today with your presentations, do you each have a favorite thing or two about Austin that you'd like to share with our audience? David, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, for me, it's the proximity of Austin to the Texas Hill Country with all its beautiful springs and spring-fed rivers and the diversity of wildlife they support. And of course, that natural beauty makes Austin attractive for all the cultural and artistic diversity that Austin is so well known for. Justin, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'd actually echo that. I'd share a lot of that with you. And that my favorite thing about Austin is the surrounding hill country towns, along with Austin, of course, is their history of preservation of its natural areas like Barton Springs, Greenbelt, Jacobs Well, even McKinney Falls out east, and how the city is still dedicated to making these special places accessible for public recreation. And of course, to layer on top of that, Austin's passion for music, where there's always somebody around playing music, and a lot of times at the special natural areas that we'll be talking about tonight.
Thank you both. Let's begin with our first presentation from Dr. David Hillis.
Recording in progress.
All right. Well, as we just were talking about, um, why is it that Austin is such a great place to live and on just about everybody's top 10 place? And there are a number of factors. There's a lot of things about the quality of life and its diversity, all the wonderful entertainment that Justin mentioned, the great parks and recreation, and the natural diversity of the city is what makes it attractive to many people. And the fact that it does have such a abundant, clean water supply allows for the population to be here to begin with. And of course, there's the weirdness factor as well, and all these things kind of tie together at Barton Springs Pool. And Barton Springs is one of the big springs that occurs along the edge of the Texas Hill Country, the Edwards Plateau, and it's basically a product of the Edwards Aquifer, which is like a giant underground sponge that feeds that's up in the hill country, and then is fed under pressure to the artesian zone that runs along basically essentially where I-35 runs from down towards San Antonio and then out to the west from that. And along that region, there are lots of springs, and most of the cities along this area, Austin, San Antonio, and many others, grew up along those springs. So when I first came to UT as a faculty member in the mid 1980s, I wanted to start studying the biology of this Edwards Aquifer as a way of understanding a little bit more about the aquifer and how it's connected to the people, its different uses and resources, and also the relationships of the animals that live in the aquifer can tell us a lot about how the different parts of the aquifer are physically connected. And so that, of course, brought us immediately to sampling Austin's, well, the caves around throughout this region, but also for the of the springs. Here's a picture of me from about 30 years ago. You can see I've changed a little bit since then, of going down into these caves in the aquifer looking for salamanders. And one of the sampling points locally here in Austin is, of course, Barton Springs, which is not only biologically and geologically of interest, but obviously a cultural centerpiece of Austin as well. And as we began studying it, we quickly realized there was a species of salamander that lived in Barton Springs that didn't occur anywhere else in the world. And so it was clear that this was a focal point for protection of the springs. So many conservation groups began rallying around the salamander and putting out all kinds of T-shirts and frisbees and other things talking about the salamander. And the salamander became kind of a centerpiece for Austin conservation in the late 1980s. But the problem was is at the time the pool was operated sort of like a standard swimming pool rather than a natural resource. And at the time, a lot of the cleaning methods that were being used by the city were nearly eliminating the salamander populations. So that was clearly a problem. So we created a liaison committee between the city and the university to develop more salamander-friendly cleaning methods so that both the salamanders and the humans could enjoy the springs together. And then over the next few years, there were a lot of political fights about interest as interest began to grow in protecting the springs and protecting the water resources of Austin. It kind of came to a head in 1992 when the city approved the Save Our Springs ordinance, which was an ordinance to help protect the natural resources and particularly the watersheds and the springs of Austin. And that was passed by overwhelming majority. And then at the same time, pro-environment candidates were elected to the city council, and the city began to really focus on conservation of the water resources and conservation of the wildlife associated with those springs. And about the same time, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service finished its preliminary finding that this new species of salamander that we had described was likely an endangered species. And so it began the paperwork to declare it as an endangered species. So the next year, in 1993, we officially described the salamander. And so this was in the formal scientific literature, the name of the Barton Springs salamander and its scientific name, Euresia sosorum, which took its name after that Save Our Springs SOS initiative. And so that sort of, at that point, the species was officially described And the discussion about its status and protection became more serious. And that then a lot of politicians began weighing in on this, and a lot of others. But there was these are just some headlines from about this time in 1993, after the species description came out. So first, just a very neutral one saying state calls for more study of the salamanders. And then there was a note that the U.S. had delayed protection of the salamander for some reason. And the reasons for that kind of came out pretty quickly. It turned out that Governor Bush opposed the salamander protection, and a number of other people did. The concern was that if the salamander was declared endangered, that it would cease development in Austin and would impede development. And there were some, maybe the funniest newspaper article headline I ever saw was this one that said, "Salamander stirs calls of morality and communism." It's kind of hard to imagine a salamander having anything to do with communism, but that was kind of the state of the affairs in the mid-1990s. And then this kind of bombshell announcement from the Department of Interior that the salamander had been pulled from endangered consideration, despite all the scientists and their own staff of Fish and Wildlife Service saying that it should be listed as endangered. So at that point, it went to court, and the salamander got its day in court. And the judge in this suit ruled that the salamander deal that had kept it from being protected broke the law, and that the Interior Department had to base its decision based solely on the best scientific data. Well, the scientific data were pretty clear. And so what that meant is that the Boston Springs salamander was listed as an endangered species in 1997. And so you know what happened next, of course, with an endangered species, as people had been worried, then that meant all development in Austin ceased and Austin stopped growing. And of course, that's not what happened at all. Exactly the opposite happened. In the last 30 years, Austin's protection of Austin's water supply as a result of that decision led to make Austin even more attractive and more livable, and more people have come here, and Austin has actually really grown and thrived as a city as a result of that. If we didn't have the protection of the water supply, it's not really clear that that development could even have occurred, because we wouldn't have really had the water to be able to do it. Since that 1997 decision, the city of Austin has really turned around, and as I said, the city council was elected a number of environment-friendly people, and so the city built the Barton Springs Salamander Breeding Facility to try to breed salamanders in the case of a catastrophe that could be reintroduced. And it also partnered with Texas Parks and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and hired a lot of biologists to work on watershed protection, restored habitat in Barton Springs, and basically has worked very hard to protect Austin's water resources, all very positive developments. And so just to give you an idea of how effective that's been, since the restoration of the salamander habitat in Eliza Springs in 2003, you can see before that, the salamander populations were extremely low and in danger of going out completely. And since then, they've gone up and down with the droughts and floods and so on, but you can see that the post restoration of the habitat, the salamander numbers have been considerably higher. So the restoration efforts have been extremely successful. And others who've worked with the watershed protection, like Deanne Chamberlain, we worked with Deanne in discovering and actually studying the salamanders and continuing to study them, and in doing so, figured out there's actually 2 species of salamanders that are only found at Barton Springs. And so we also named a second species, the Austin blind salamander, which is shown here. This is one that occurs deep underground. The Barton Springs salamander occurs more at the surface. But these 2 salamanders have now become kind of a poster children for Austin's conservation efforts. And here's a map just of the hill country showing the salamanders that we've studied across other springs and caves across. And each of the colored dots refers to a different species. So you can see this is the Barton Springs salamander in orange over here, and the Austin blind salamander in black. But there are other salamanders north of the Colorado River and west going out towards Del Rio. And those salamanders have become critical in conservation efforts for a lot of the springs and spring-fed river systems throughout the Texas Hill Country. So it just kind of conclude, we can think of, have the salamanders done enough to save the humans and kind of turning things around? I would say, it's really not humans versus salamanders. That the saving of the salamanders is also the saving of humans, because what the salamanders need is clean water. They need water quality and water quantity, the same kind of things that humans need. And so protecting the salamanders actually gave us a way to work on conservation of protecting natural resources that were important for all of us. And so obviously protecting the water supply that we all need to survive was a big part of this. So with that, I want to turn it over to Justin, who can tell you a lot more about the hydrology and the geology of the spring systems. I think you need to turn on your microphone, Justin.
Okie doke. Alrighty, sorry about that. And yeah, thanks, David. I guess starting over again, I'm Justin Camp. I've been the hydrogeologic technician for 17 years, 10 of which are with the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District. And I'm excited tonight to share some of the cool science and conservation efforts I've been a part of in Central Texas. And so, what is the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District? That large name for such an organization. And well, it was established in about 38 years ago by the Texas legislature to study and research parts of the Edwards and Trinity aquifers. And based on our scientific investigations, we are tasked with creating regulations on how we use and protect our aquifers. So what is a groundwater conservation district, or a GCD? Well, they work to understand and manage aquifers and our groundwater systems. They are local government entities. They are independent from cities and counties. There are 98 GCDs throughout the state. Most are created by legislative action, and they all operate a little bit differently from one another, as they all have their own set of rules. Here's a quick map showing the outline of the Barton Springs district boundary, covering areas between Austin and San Marcos. Okay, so why is understanding Central Texas aquifers important? Well, one really important factor is it's part of our water supply. Also, things like drought management, regulatory compliance, climate change, water quality, and ecosystem health. So water supply. Question I regularly ask folks is, do you know where your water comes from? In Austin, in the Hill Country, the bulk of our water supply comes from groundwater from the Edwards Aquifer and surface water from the Colorado River or our lakes. And then drought management, also important that we study and we can determine types of drought and non-drought based on high or low aquifer water levels, or how much spring flow is coming out of Barton Springs, which I'll get into a little bit later. All of which is tied to how much or how little rain we receive. Also, I'll get into a little bit later. Climate change. Drought management and regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance is very important in that there are state and local regulations tied to groundwater use, and following these helps balance our water usage while preserving the long-term health of our aquifers. So wells that are being drilled, in particular in my district, it's important that the construction of those, which are really our windows into the aquifer, that those are constructed in a proper way. And climate change, I was going to get here soon enough, can also have various impacts on groundwater and their dynamics, and it can influence water availability, including changing rain patterns, increased evaporation and transpiration rates. In fact, the Barton Springs district has been in drought for the last 33 months. And with the typical dry summer that we usually expect here in Texas, right around the corner, we might expect harsher than normal conditions. and water quality. Of course, proper monitoring and groundwater of our groundwater is important to public health and our shared environment for the prevention and timely response to possible pollution and contamination, because I think we can all appreciate having clean water to drink. And then lastly, as Dr. Hillis has kind of walked us through already, it's not just us that rely on the clean water. Groundwater systems are often interconnected to surface water systems like wetlands, lakes, of course, springs, and maintaining sustainable water levels and quality helps preserve those aquatic habitats and their biodiversity, like the Barton Springs and Austin Blind salamander. So, what exactly is it we're researching, regulating, and protecting? Well, it's the Edwards Aquifer and the Trinity aquifers. And those aquifers are karst aquifers, which means they're characterized by the presence of sinkholes, sinking streams, caves, large and small, and large springs. They are the most prolific artesian aquifers in the world. I'll go into artesian a little bit later in the presentation. And the segment we oversee feeds Barton Springs. And quickly, this is a highlighted area of the Barton Springs segment we oversee, while those other segments are overseen by separate sister GCDs, groundwater conservation districts. Okay, so we're going to talk a little geology, or actually we're going to talk a lot of geology in a small amount of time. We'll try to run through about 145 million years of Earth history in about 145 seconds. Somebody time me. So Texas in the Cretaceous era 66 to 145 million years ago was under a warm, shallow sea, teeming with aquatic life we find those fossils today when we're walking around in creek beds and really anywhere around Austin. And these shallow seas would rise and they would fall. And those rising and falling seas over time created different depositional environments or layered sedimentary rocks. As you can see in the picture on the right, mainly limestone where life forms that died and became fossils or other soft minerals dissolved out. And when they dissolved out, they left behind these voids or holes that resemble a honeycomb or like a Swiss cheese kind of texture. Now, with that honeycomb limestone laid down hundreds of millions of years ago, we skip up to about 17 million years ago, where there was an abundance of earthquakes and other seismic events that caused the rocks to fault and basically jumble and drop in the area we call the Balcones Fault Zone. Imagine this cross section that we're looking at. This image is oriented as the left being West Texas and the right being the Houston area and the Gulf. So any water on the surface is flowing from west to east as it makes its way to the ocean. And that brings us to our hydrozones because of that faulting, rocks at the surface have been displaced, giving us different hydrozones. These are basically what types of rock are at the surface and what happens to water when it runs across those surfaces. And the three that we'll discuss tonight are the contributing, the recharge, and the confined zones. And maybe some of you have driven over Mopac through Austin and noticed the signs that indicate you are driving over the sensitive recharge zone of the Edwards Aquifer. Okay, now let's look at a cross-section of the different zones and how they work. Remember, we're still looking at this slide as if the contributing zone was Wimberley or Dripping Springs further out west. So rain that hits the ground in the area contributes that flowing water towards the recharge zone located a little bit further east towards Austin. So we're moving from west to east with our flowing water. And the recharge zone. Okay, so the recharge zone is a surface made up of fractures, caves, and sinkholes where surface water from rainfall and streams infiltrates into the underground aquifer. And you can see our faulting kind of slanted there within the recharge zone leading into those cave systems. Okay, so here's a few pictures of recharge features. We have Whirlpool Cave on the left. That's during a dry time, so that's near a creek bed, and that gate was built on top of the cave to allow critters and water to enter, but keep out people, that need special permission to get in. So that middle picture you're looking at is actual whirlpool cave during a flooding event. So you can imagine there's all kinds of infiltration going on there. And then on the far right, there's little swallows in Onion Creek, in the Onion Creek bed, taking on recharge in that beautiful little whirlpool there. Okay, and to illustrate recharge from a numbers or a data perspective, this slide, we're looking at real-time flow gauges along creeks within the recharge zone. So those numbers you're looking at, there is water passing by these gauging stations, and they're letting us know how much water. And so it's being measured in cubic feet per second, a certain volume of water passing through that point in that particular time. And so I'll point your attention to the very bottom numbers in this Onion Creek area, this 102 down here. You notice that flow up here is really high. Well, as it crosses down and it moves further downstream and into Buda, we have our 5. So that's literal recharge in action where we're watching flow. It's not making it to Buda. It's actually infiltrating into the ground, into the recharge zone. Now, once water has entered the underground from the surface, it travels through limestone spaces, large and small, like the magnificent cavern you see here, the interspace caverns. And even those smaller and tighter spaces like the Edwards limestone honeycomb texture, water moves through that too. So scientists, as adventurous ones like Dr. Hillis and the scientists you see up above in the far right, like to climb into these caves to better understand how they work and map them and where they go. And lastly, of our hydro zones, the confined zone. So what happens when water enters as recharge? Well, as that water continues to enter the aquifer through the recharge zone, it pushes down on water already inside the aquifer. So this water is eventually pushed into the confined zone, which basically just means that it's now under pressure and it's looking for its way out. Where is its outlet going to be? And some of those places are springs, like our Barton Springs or Jacob's Well out in Wimberley. Even a drilled well, you can see on the far right. And here's a close-up of discharge at Barton Springs, one of those geologic sweet spots where faulting has allowed groundwater to come up to the surface. So this is, like I said, Barton Springs Fault, located inside the pool right next to the diving board. Okay, so all of that sounds great. We talked a little bit about, I wonder how long it took me to get through all of that geologic time, but now we've got to tie all of what this means into why the district and other scientists in Central Texas do what they do. Or in other words, how do we use science to inform regulation and policy? And just to name some of the scientific work that scientists around Austin carry out include geologic mapping. And so this helps us understand where those sensitive hydrozones that we talked about earlier, like the recharge zone, where those are located at the surface, because those areas have critical environmental features like caves that we want to try our best to avoid building on top of or allowing some harmful pollution to enter and ultimately get into our drinking water. So you can see how that honeycomb picture at the top, at the surface, something that we're mapping, and a really happy geologist at the bottom who found a fault and is going to ultimately create a really informative map like the one on the right that delineates different rock types with those different colors. And now dye tracing, some of my favorite work to investigate the aquifer. So how water behaves once it enters the ground is not always obvious. Sometimes those places of recharge are too small or even too dangerous for scientists to go. So one method of tracking where the groundwater goes, how fast it moves, and the different connections within the aquifer system is by injecting a non-toxic fluorescent dye. And so the figure on the right shows several different dye studies, with one of them showing dye injected in a cave near Buda, further down south of Austin, and traveling 17 miles north to Barton Springs in about 3 days, the equivalent of water moving 5 miles per day. Now, more on science, how science meets the policy. Over the course of decades of countless hydrologic studies and modeling of the Edwards Aquifer, this science has helped inform conservation policies, especially in Central Texas, where water can be scarce for very long periods of time. Um, for example, how much flow from Barton Springs or water levels in wells, like the one shown, can help determine what kind of drought stages we're in. And just quickly, if you can imagine, if flow at Barton Springs is, say, above 38 CFS, we're in a good place. But if it continues to drop, we're understanding that, okay, water levels in the aquifer are falling. Therefore, recharge isn't happening. Where's our rainfall coming in? And we can actually implement further stages of drought. And as we fall into further stages of drought, we ask people to conserve a little bit more, depending on how deep of a stage of drought we go into. And again, we'll talk about our friends at Barton Springs and how local scientists basically aim to protect the aquifer's water quality and the quantity as well, not just for humans, but also for the species like the salamanders. Protecting the Barton Springs salamander, the Austin blind salamander, it's crucial because they are endemic to the Edwards Aquifer, meaning they exist nowhere else in the world. So their survival depends on clean, stable groundwater conditions, making them very key indicators, like David was mentioning, of the water quality. So by creating policy to protect these salamanders, we also safeguard the health of the aquifer that we share. And lastly, to wrap up, I'll mention the importance of education and outreach by the district, by local scientists in Austin, of course, throughout Central Texas and everywhere, that these beautiful and sensitive resources we find in Austin and the Hill Country, the more we know about our natural resources, the more we are fostering environmental stewardship and ensuring protection of these vital ecosystems for future generations. And as much as I love pouring dye into caves and looking at rocks, it's important that I share what I learn. In fact, it reminds me of an expression from a TV show that I used to watch called The Mythbusters, where the host said, "The difference between messing around and science is writing down the results." In fact, I've always remember that, and I don't think he used the term messing around. He used a different phrase for that. But nonetheless, when I was given the opportunity to speak with y'all, I jumped at it to continue, this historical Austin tradition of sharing some of what I've learned and what makes Austin and the Hill Country worth protecting. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Aaron for some questions.
Thank you both for those fascinating presentations. You give us a lot to think about when it comes to water conservation and the role of wildlife in our ecosystems. We do have one quick Q&A question for David. David, in your first slide, what is the bad water line?
Okay, that's a boundary between very fresh water that has very low salt content and much more saline water that's found below it and to the east. And so in Justin's slides, I think he represented the area to the east as a saline zone. That's because the water in that region is much saltier, and and it's so it's found below and to the east of that freshwater line. So if you drill a well over in that part of the aquifer, it comes up as salt water rather than as clean fresh water. And most of the animals I was talking about can't live in that saline zone. It's poisonous to them. But Justin, you may have some more information about that you want to share.
Yeah, David's right in that the bad water line, or I guess we'll just call it the saline zone. And like David was saying, it's very high in dissolved solids, in that geologically what that means is that once water is actually over, we'll call the saline water zone anything east of I-35. It's kind of a weird corroboration geologically that the bad waterline finds follows I-35. But so water that's moving through the aquifer in those areas are moving very, very slow. I mentioned water in the recharge zone moving from Buda to Barton Springs in about 3 days. That's relatively fast. In the saline zone, water can be moving maybe a foot every couple of weeks. And because it's moving so slowly, that water's residence time within the rock, it's collecting a lot of those minerals, calcium, magnesium, and stuff like that, that make those dissolved solids really high and therefore kind of saline and salty.
I see that we're getting some more questions in the Q&A function. Please and ask any questions you guys have, but for the meantime, we'll go through the questions we have. So for dye tracing, so Zach asks, for dye tracing, what are some of the longer timelines for water to go from carts to springs, or specifically Barton Springs?
So the question is, what are some of the longer time? How
Yeah.
long? Yeah, that's a great question. So that really dependent on what kind of year we're having regarding rain flow. Is it a wet year like 2015 and 2018 where we had those huge floods? You can imagine water is moving through the aquifer really fast in wet seasons, in wet times when there's recharge happening at a faster and consistent rate. Right now, if we're in drought currently right now. I mentioned about 33 months of drought. And so that's monthly falling underneath our historical average for those past 33 months. And as we're in a very dry period, if I were to pour in dye into that same cave, it could take months to get to Barton Springs. In fact, I would probably have to flush it in with a truckload of water just to make sure that it got down into the aquifer. So the travel times through the aquifer is very dependent on recharge rainfall.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that you guys have to like push water in with a truck. We got a question that said, I believe Justin, you mentioned, I think they meant 33 months, but they said 33 years of drought. But I believe you meant 33 months of drought, correct?
That's correct.
So they asked how much longer is that sustainable based on our current groundwater, but I think it's under the assumption that it was 33 years of drought. So
yeah, what I'll do is I'll answer that question and apologize for that mistake. If we were in 33 years of drought, I'm not sure, Dave, any of us would actually be here right now. But so that's a question that only continued science can help to at least approximate. When the only way that we break out of a drought is if we get enough rain, which means above average rainfall for a year or two, and not just 1 year. It can take a longer amount of time, a couple of years of that above average rainfall to get us back out of the depths that we've been in. Right now we're being able to sustain during water levels and flow of Barton Springs during this prolonged drought, but that takes a lot of the implementation of having those drought stages and asking people and other entities that use groundwater for their water supply to cut back. So I was showing you that colorful diagram of when Barton Springs is at a certain flow. Well, when that drops down, we ask people to drop back, say 20%, and then 30%, and then 40%, and then in some cases all together. All trying to maintain that people have access to groundwater and their water supply, but the conservation efforts to at least help maintain those things for these long periods of drought.
I'll just add that in general, we're on a more or less about over long term, about a 5-year cycle between drought and flood that's kind of tied to the El Nino La Nina oscillation. And so during El Nino periods, we tend to be wetter, and La Nina periods drier. And so it's if you go back over the long-term records, we've been going up and down in drought and aquifer for a very long period of time. The problem is that during the wet periods, if you have 5 years of wet period, then the public tends to forget or stop paying attention to the water, and then we tend to build up and start using more of the resources. And then the problem is that the next drought period, it just compounds the problem. And so every drought period we hit, it becomes a little bit harder to get through it because of the increased demands by humans. And so it's in some ways we're fortunate that we have this cycle, but in other ways it kind of works against the conservation efforts, because 5 years is kind of a long period for humans to remember. And so every time we go one of these 5-year droughts, the newspaper starts saying, well, this is like the record drought of, we've never had it this dry. And if you go back 5 years ago, it was about that dry before. And so it is getting worse, but it's largely getting worse just because of our increasing usage, not because of the rainfall patterns, which are kind of a fairly predictable long-term measure.
I think this is a question for Justin. Does WPD, BSEACD, or USGS, or all three manage the CFS station at Barton Springs?
A great question. So that's operated by the USGS. That is meaning that they take care of the equipment inside of it, but the City of Austin Watershed Protection actually funds the maintaining of that. The district does not. We certainly use that, but and pay attention to the data that's being collected. But that is in cooperation between the USGS and the City of Austin Watershed Protection.
Dr. Hillis, why is it important to protect these cave creatures like the salamanders? How does it affect the ordinary person in Austin?
Well, there are a couple of different ways to answer that question, but I guess in a very practical way, you can think of the salamanders as like the canary in the coal mine. And as long as the salamander populations are healthy, we know that the water quality and quantity in the aquifer is also healthy. And so they serve a very useful purpose as kind of an indicator of the overall aquifer health. But then kind of in a broader, maybe a little bit more philosophical way to answer that is that it's part of what makes Austin such an attractive place. Its biodiversity is a big component of what makes Austin and the surrounding hill country unique and interesting to humans. And certainly the salamanders are a part of that. So even if you never get to see a salamander, just knowing that these unique species are here and present in the city is something that that I think we can all celebrate.
Dr. Hillis, I believe you had a graph that depicted the salamander population falling recently. Why is that?
Well, the graph I showed was just the salamanders at one of the spring outlets at Eliza Springs. And those, now that the habitat's been restored there, the populations are a lot better than they were before the habitat was restored. But they go up and down quite a bit with basically with flow rate. And so when the aquifer flow rates are high, it tends to oxygenate the water and produces excellent conditions for salamanders and for salamander food, and the salamanders reproduce more and the populations go up. And then when we have a drought, they drop back down. And so the salamander populations are actually just another kind of indirect measure of the flow rate over kind of averaged over a longer period of time.
Justin, I believe this was you, but correct me if it wasn't. You mentioned cleaning the water at Barton Springs. What is that and how effective is it?
Yeah, it's not actually the water that's being cleaned, it's the pool area itself. And so there's certain areas that, you have to think about safety standards for humans. And so some of the shallow areas get growths of things like diatoms, which make the surface rather slippery. And so for a long time before we started trying to preserve the salamanders, the pool staff was using harsh chemicals like copper sulfate and then high pressure hoses to blast out the crevices. And that made the surface clean like a swimming pool, but unfortunately it also killed all the living creatures that were there. And so the cleaning methods we developed were kind of ways to make it safe for humans and at the same time safe for protecting the salamander habitat. And so the city's gotten to be very good at protecting the salamanders, and the salamanders have responded quite well to those improved measures.
I believe this is the last audience Q&A. And this question is for both of you, Justin and Davis. What are the most significant things we can do to protect our springs and our groundwater?
Well, I think there are a lot of different measures. I think the most important thing is probably water conservation, and actually I'd say two important things: water conservation and making sure that we don't let a lot of pollutants enter into the recharge zone and then into the aquifer. And so we have to be very careful about what we do with disposal of chemicals and waste and so on, so that it doesn't wash into the aquifer, which will immediately go directly down in the aquifer and degrade the water quality. And then, of course, conserving water, not using more water than we need is a big part of it. And Justin, you may have other things you want to add.
I'd again echo that those sentiments loud and clear, especially the conservation of water, because here in Central Texas, we are in a state of perpetual drought. So measures to make sure that there is a one-to-one relationship between somebody using their well and then what's coming out at Barton Springs. So every gallon that you're taking out of your well, that is a gallon being taken away from Barton Springs. And just as a fair way of thinking of that is, if you're wasting your water and watering your lawn during times of drought when that it's not that important, uh, you're taking away from the recreation and of course the ecosystem health of the Barton Springs salamanders and the rest of us. So conservation, not wasting water, and then protecting those critical environmental features like David is also mentioning. You don't want to build over those things. You don't want to build a highway, or if you do, there are smart ways of doing that. This is a growing city, so we have to find the balance between being able to find that growth and the protection that's necessary. That would be my parting words on and how to conserve and protect uh, the water quality of our aquifer systems.
I think many of us are concerned about recent climate change. So what is the prognosis for the water and salamanders given that climate change?
Well, yeah, it's a little bit of a complex answer because, of course, as we globally heat is we globally get warmer, that increases evaporation, which also increases precipitation. And so it's a complex thing in terms of the aquifer, because the increased precipitation means there's actually more rainfall going in to recharge the aquifer, but there's also more evaporation. And then, of course, with the human use is constantly going up. And so it's not a simple thing that we're sure about what the answer is about how climate change is going to affect the future of the salamanders. My guess is that human development and human impact is probably a much bigger short-term concern for the salamanders, and that climate change is going to be a long-term concern for all of us for many reasons. And so there's certainly a lot of challenges in our future, but I think that the climate change is just one of many for the salamanders and for the aquifer.
At the moment, we don't have any more audience Q&A questions, but I do some questions for both David and Justin. If anyone in the audience has any questions pop up while they're speaking, please ask in the Q&A and we will absolutely get to them. So for both David and Justin, you each represent a different view into the challenges of water protection. How do academic and public organizations such as UT and then the city of Austin and the conservation district work together on scientific projects or on conservation efforts? And if possible, if could you give some examples from your own background or experience?
Well, I think Justin and I kind of represent the answer to that question pretty well. Since I'm in an academic organization and Justin works in a public organization, and the academic organizations, at academic organizations like myself tend to focus on how problems arise and how they might be solved. But to put those solutions in action requires cooperation with public organizations, and as Justin mentioned, public outreach. And both of those aspects are critical to effective solutions. You have to put solutions into action. And so in our case, that's why we worked closely with the City of Austin Water Protection Department and Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Barton Springs Aquifer District and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service all together in developing the solutions to protect these salamanders and the aquifer habitat. And so I think that's the critical thing is just cooperation among all these different groups and working towards a common goal.
Yeah, and to add another real world plan that through a cooperation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the City of Austin and the Barton Springs District is something called a habitat conservation plan. And most entities have a habitat conservation plan to be able to quantify what kind of things are happening to salamanders during certain conditions. And so from my district's perspective, it's what kind of drought we're in and what kind of pumping from wells in the aquifer are happening. And without getting too in the weeds, we want to find that balance in between how much is being allowed to be pumped from the aquifer and then how much is ultimately being allowed to get to the springs for the salamander habitat in its conservation.
Yeah, I definitely see that there's a lot of important coordination required since researchers and academics create solutions, think about problems, and then you have to implement them, which is often easier said than done. So, um, another issue I think in recent years has been like having access to clean water, right? Having clean, accessible water when we need it matters for everyone. Well, most people don't probably understand the way that you guys as scientists do. What drives the availability of clean water? What is one factor in when it comes to available clean water do you wish that more people knew about?
You want to answer that first, Justin?
Sure. I guess first thing that comes to mind is just so the question is about how clean water or the access to the quantity of water. What drives the availability of clean water?
I guess kind of both.
Okay. I guess it's determining where getting back to the development in this growing city in the hill country as well is where are you developing and over those critically sensitive zones like the recharge zone that we were talking about, even the contributing zone. So in a smart way, developing whether that's new housing developments or roadways, doing it in the in a way that decreases the impact on those critical features like caves and sinkholes and joints and crevices. That is probably the best way to make sure that you're getting the best water quality. Any You want to remove any human impact from the natural system as you possibly can. I hope that that kind of suffices, but I hand it over to David for a better water quality impact
Well,
scenario as
into
well.
the other part of the question that Aaron asked about what one factor about the clean water I wish more people appreciated or knew about, and that's just the reemphasizing the fact that all of life depends on water. Water is literally life, and for humans as well as for all the plants and animals of the area. And water in Texas is our most limiting resource for humans, and we need it to protect our quality of life, which of course also means that it also is critical for protecting the beauty and biodiversity of the state. And so I think more than probably any other factor, water is going to be our biggest primary concern in the coming years in Texas.
In these questions, you each have addressed sustainability and conservation for important natural resources such as water here in Central Texas. Since you have people joining from all over Texas and possibly the country, are there principles from what you each shared that would apply outside of Central Texas as well?
Well, yeah, I would say a general truth that applies anywhere is that people are going to protect what they love and they're going to love what they know. And so for me, it all starts with education and getting people to experience nature. The more they do that, the more they will know about and care about nature and then be excited about protecting it. I think that's a general principle that certainly applies here in Austin, but it applies more generally outside of Central Texas as well.
Yeah, well said. I don't think I'd have anything to add to that.
I think we'll wrap up with this question. What has your career journey been like in science? What setbacks or surprises on your career path have met you along the way?
Well, all my favorite career moments have been in seeing my academic work put into public policy and action. So certainly working with the city and with other government agencies in terms of protecting the salamander, protecting our aquifer has been a highlight of my career. But that kind of public engagement is also one of the reasons that my latest book that you mentioned, The Armadillos to Sisyphus, a naturalist in the Texas Hill Country, was really, I wrote that really to engage the public in the protection and revitalization of the biodiversity of a place that everybody loves, the Texas Hill Country. And I wanted to help people understand why that's such a beautiful place and why it's important to protect and some of the things that they can do to help protect it. And so that's really, for me, the highlight of my academic career is that kind of public outreach and connection, so that the scientific work that I do can have more public impact. How
Yeah,
about
I'd say
you?
to kind of relay back to David's answer to the last question is that, you know, people and the things that they love, they will protect them and they will, put efforts and into something that means something to them. And that's certainly what's happened to me as I grew up here in Austin. It was important to me that this is home. This was important for me to protect. And, as a kid running around in these different areas, it was important to realize that they to protect them, it wasn't just going to happen on its own, that there was an important part of understanding those things that needed to go into the general understanding, and general understanding being the public, and being convinced by sound sound science. And that science is able to inform particular policy. And I've seen that historically in Austin. I see that currently going on right now. And I actually get to live and be a part of a lot of that with, the science that the district is providing and the field work that it takes, the going outside and collecting this data takes a lot of work to compile this and make some sensible science to enact some of that policy. And so from my perspective, doing something that I've always loved, being outside, has enabled me to be a part of what I believe the true solution into keeping a city like Austin, alive and healthy. Has gone through using again sound science and informing policy.
I'm gonna add one last question real quick. What has been y'all's favorite career moment, if you can name one?
Well, I think I did name my career moment is maybe working with the city to come with, kind of to really turn things around and with the salamander, from it being a very grave and seemingly hopeless issue to something that looks quite positive in terms of the salamander and the water supply and the future of Austin.
And the question was, what's the most fondest career
Moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I've got two that I feel like I need to mention. One being crawling into a cave with a mentor of mine, Nico Howard, and not being able to get past some part of me to get deeper into the cave. But I understood this thing, that if I wanted to be a part of the really important stuff that Nico was investigating inside these caves, I had to get over that fear. And that it didn't take me long, but that was really an amazing thing to experience and get over. The other was getting back to some of that dye tracing that I showed some of, is mixing the dye and then being a part of a dye trace is some exhilarating work, in that, you truly are investigating something that can't be seen or is very hard to see. And that the aquifer in the Trinity, in the Edwards, within Hayes and Travis County, is still revealing its secrets through a lot of these scientific investigations. So dye tracing will always be, I think I'll always be tied to it, and the story that it actually helps us derive of what's under our feet.
There's some fantastic moments, and we are very grateful to both of you for helping out City of Austin and the Central Texas area as a whole. As we wrap up, I want to extend a huge thank you to our speakers, Dr. David Hillis and Justin Camp, for sharing their insights with us today. I also want to thank all of you for joining us. Your engagement makes events like these possible. The Texas Science Festival will continue with exciting events happening daily through March 6th, Thursday. So be sure to spread the word and encourage your friends to check out the schedule. If you are a prospective student, we have another event tomorrow afternoon, both online and in person, where you can hear from current students and staff, including representatives from more of our CNS honors programs. You can find the full CNS festival schedule at science-fest.utexas.edu. Once again, we truly appreciate your spending your time with us this evening. Happy World Wildlife Day, and we hope to see you at more festival events soon.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, y'all.